The House will be in order. With great confidence in our caucus, I will not seek re-election to Democratic leadership in the next Congress. For me, the hour's come for a new generation to lead the Democratic caucus.
As House Democratic leaders pass the torch to a younger generation of lawmakers, Joe Biden considers running for re-election in 2024. Hello and welcome to Inside America with me, Ghida Fakhry. As Democrats in Congress hold their leadership election this week, the top 3 positions will go to the next generation of Democrats. Earlier this month, Nancy Pelosi, the 82-year-old Speaker of the House of Representatives, announced that she will step down as the top House Democrat after nearly 2 decades in leadership positions. Her decision, which comes after her party lost its majority in the House in the midterm elections, paves the way for 52-year-old Congressman Hakeem Jeffries of New York to become the first Black House minority leader.
America is an idea. One person, one vote. Liberty and justice for all. Equal protection under the law. Government of the people, by the people, and for the people. The preeminence of the rule of law. America is an idea.
Following in Pelosi's footsteps, House Majority Leader Steny Hoyer also announced that he will be stepping down. House Majority Whip James Clyburn, who served as the number 3 House Democrat, argued that his long experience would be an asset to the younger generation of the party as he vied to remain in a top leadership position. All 3 are in their early 80s. The outgoing Congress is one of the oldest in U.S. history. Half of the House of Representatives and 2/3 of the Senate are part of the baby boomer generation born between 1946 and 1964. 7% of House members, that's 31 lawmakers out of 435, are millennials born between 1981 and 1996. So how will the generational shift in Congress affect the Democratic Party, and will it strengthen its progressive wing? Joining me now is Lanny Davis, who served as special White House counsel to President Bill Clinton and is a former member of the Democratic National Committee. Lanny Davis, we're seeing a changing of the guard in the Democratic congressional leadership. You have leaders who've ruled over the party in Congress for 2 decades and are now making way for the younger generation. Is it a victory for the progressive wing of the party, or are we going to see a tug of war between the older, more quote-unquote moderate segment of the party and the younger, more progressive generation of lawmakers?
No, I don't think it's ideological, but I think you're correct. It's generational. There are progressives who are of my generation. So you are talking about my generation yielding to a younger generation. And there are many progressives in my generation going back to President Kennedy, who invented the slogan, a new generation of leadership. But there definitely is a generational shift, and it's long due, and I applaud it.
And of course, politicians and political candidates will go with the flow. They will change their stripes to a certain extent to win over the young vote. But how likely is Biden to hold on to this age group? Because his policies quite often have looked more like Trump's than many Democrats, and certainly many progressive Democrats, would have liked to see.
Well, I'd have to disagree with you. I don't know of a single Joe Biden policy that looks more like Trump's. And
well, take immigration, take the construction of the wall at the Mexico border, take foreign policy, sanctions against Iran, Cuba, the policy on Saudi Arabia. It's hardly changed, has it, since Trump was in power?
Let's take all of those except for his, I thought, aberration regarding going to Saudi Arabia, which I believe was a mistake, and I think he believes it was a mistake. Every other issue you just named is on the opposite side of Trump. He believes in a national immigration policy that allows people to be eligible for citizenship. But nobody that I know, and I'm pretty far to the left, believes that America should have open borders, the only country on the planet that should have open borders. We've always had ways of being eligible to come to America. When my parents and my grandparents came, they had to meet certain qualifications. So Joe Biden is right smack in the middle of the progressive spectrum on a comprehensive immigration policy that allows more people to come to America and shows humane treatment for those people who are already here. For example, he supports the Dreamers Act, allowing 11 million people who have children have been here to become, at least their children, to get to be citizens. So Joe Biden's very much in the mainstream of the progressive movement on that issue.
Well, on the campaign trail, candidate Biden said that he wouldn't build another foot of the wall that Trump had started on the Mexico-US border. But his administration has apparently been quietly continuing construction on parts of the wall. That's been well documented.
But I know of no construction of a wall, at least along the lines of Donald Trump. There's always been security, electronic and other ways to secure our borders. Nobody is against securing our borders. President Biden is in that tradition, goes back 2 centuries. He opposes the inhumane and repressive and racist policies of Donald Trump. So the comparison between Joe Biden and Donald Trump, I would just respectfully say it isn't even close. Joe Biden had the greatest turnout for young people of any Democratic presidential candidate, including my friend Hillary Clinton, in 2020 when he defeated Donald Trump. And in 2022, with the Biden administration having a low approval rating, young people turned out in droves to support Democratic candidates, the highest turnout for young people in recent history. So President Biden's policies on marital equality and on civil rights and on social issues are highly popular among younger people versus older people.
But a recent poll found that about 68% of Americans don't want Biden as the nominee in 2024. In fact, another poll found that a majority of Democrats would like another candidate. What is the best option for Democrats, if not Biden?
So the issue that some people who would say they love Joe Biden's policies but don't want him to run again, and I think the polls that you're citing, of which I'm very aware, are about whether they want him to run again. And those polls are about exactly the way you began. It's time for a generational change, a lot of people feel. And there is a part of me that agrees with that. I'm supporting Joe Biden, but I do think the generational change that you started out your questioning with me is extremely important, even though I'm part of that generation of members of Congress that are being replaced by younger people.
Is Democrats' best bet that Trump becomes the nominee?
Oh, that's a great question. I hate to say that I'm rooting for Trump to run because, God forbid, he ever gets elected again. Our democracy is at risk. But there's no question it helps Democrats when Donald Trump is the topic of conversation, because we Democrats are it's a 50-50 country between liberals, progressives versus conservatives. The only way we can win this country is by winning independent swing voters who are in the suburbs, many of them Republicans, many of them women. And so we need the foil of Donald Trump much better than anybody else, because he alienates those suburban independent and many of them women Democrats, independents, and some Republicans.
But doesn't this then feed the narrative that Democrats only win when they run against someone, against Trump, as opposed to for certain ideas?
Unfortunately, there's some truth to that. If you look at political science studies, what motivates voters throughout history is to vote against somebody who they fear, as opposed to voting for somebody. So that's an unfortunate reality of democracy. Your motivator is often fear and negative energy. So I agree that we Democrats need a much better positive program to communicate to the American people. Joe Biden's accomplishments in passing very important legislation in the last 2 years, he's not given enough credit for that legislation, but we weren't effective in communicating a positive message. So we've got to do better at that.
From a legal perspective, just how serious a predicament is Trump in? You know what it's like to defend a president who's under siege.
I do.
You were special counsel to President Bill Clinton during the Monica Lewinsky scandal back in the late 1990s. How much of a challenge does Trump really face?
So it's a great comparison. I'm actually at work on a book recounting those years. There was an impeachment resolution enacted by an almost all partisan Republican House in 1998. And it was about Bill Clinton having a private relationship where he acknowledged that it was wrong and apologized. And the impeachment allegedly was about him lying about sex, but in fact, he told the truth on television in front of a grand jury. Now compare that to Donald Trump. His own Republican minority leader, Mitch McConnell, so no Democrat here, took the floor of the Senate and said Donald Trump was responsible for inciting an armed insurrection contrary to our Constitution and our democracy to resist a peaceful transition. And yet, there are Republicans who would not vote to impeach and remove Donald Trump for that offense. So you can see the double standard between the Bill Clinton issue and the Donald Trump issue.
But so in the light of all this, though, was the AG, the Attorney General, right to appoint a special counsel to oversee the two ongoing criminal investigations? Where will it lead?
Yes, I wish he didn't have to, but when there's this kind of politically charged environment, a special counsel is less likely to be charged with acting for political reasons. But there are some Republicans who don't care about facts and really trade in lies. America is a country of extremes, as every country has, but within the middle, let's say about 60% of the American people are willing to reach out to one another with civility, to disagree agreeably, and to build coalitions to govern. And in our history, we had a civil war. We've had a lot of problems with racism and with extremism, from the Ku Klux Klan all the way through the segregation in the Deep South. We have managed to survive and keep our democracy intact. And you can see in the last election in 2022, there is still great hope, because the Trump candidates, the lying, Trump-denying candidates who undermine democracy, were all defeated, despite predictions to the contrary. So I'm pretty hopeful, especially going back to your theme about the handoff that is now necessary from one generation to another. And if that means Joe Biden decides not to run because he decides that it's ready to hand off to somebody else who could be anybody who happens to be running for the Republican nomination, then the generational shift is something I applaud. And I think so with Joe Biden if he decides not to run again.
Lanny Davis, former special White House counsel to President Bill Clinton, thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
As the Democratic Party considers its options for 2024 and undergoes a generational shift, Joe Biden, who turned 80 last week, became the first octogenarian president of the United States. Biden, who is reportedly considering running for re-election in 2024, would be 82 on the day of his second inauguration. Before Biden, Ronald Reagan, who left office when he was 77, was the oldest U.S. president. According to a recent poll, 86% of Americans say they believe there should be a cutoff age of 75 for serving as president. Midterm election results showed that young voters, who overwhelmingly voted Democrat in the 2022 midterms, played a significant role in thwarting a much-expected Republican red wave, with nearly 30% of young adults between the ages of 18 and 29 estimated to have voted in these elections. That's the second highest young voter turnout of the last 30 years. There were over 8 million newly eligible young voters in the midterms, with almost 4 million youth of color, including 2 million Latinos and 1.2 million Black youth. So how will the shifting demographics in the U.S. affect Democrats' chances of keeping the White House? And with 56% of Democrats already saying that they want a new party standard-bearer in 2024, will President Biden seek re-election? Joining me now to discuss all this and more is Douglas Mackinnon, who served as a writer in the White House for Presidents Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush. He also worked on 3 presidential campaigns. Douglas Mackinnon, you are a registered independent, but you have an interesting scenario for 2024. You say that Biden will replace Kamala Harris, the vice president, with Gavin Newsom, the California governor, and then resign, essentially leapfrogging Newsom into the White House. That's quite a stretch, though, isn't it? What makes you believe that that's what will happen?
Well, it is a stretch. It's one of those things where I wrote it with a little bit of tongue in cheek. It wasn't a serious scenario in the sense of it. I did it in a column for my newspaper, The Hill, about 3 weeks ago. And the idea of that piece was to sort of jumpstart a dialogue about the Democratic side of the equation for 2024, because they are in a bit of a bind in terms of, does President Biden stay on the ticket? Does he want Kamala Harris to be, his heir apparent? Or because if you talk to Ghida, if you talk to a number of Democrats in and around Washington, D.C., they are not too secure with having President Biden nor Vice President Harris on the ticket for 2024. And if that's the reality, then who is on the bench, the Democrats in 2024? And if you look at the field, it's a little bit thinner than it was probably in 2020.
But the California governor has said just a couple of days ago that he wasn't on the bench, that he does not intend to run for president. Of course, all of this could change, but he says even if Biden chooses not to run in 2024, he isn't going to be a candidate.
Yeah, and I think
is the party ready to turn away from Biden-Harris?
Well, that's the interesting thing too, because it's one of those things where it's sort of like they're low-keying the 2024 election. They're not quite sure what to do, because I think in a way, so many Democrat power brokers in Washington, D.C. feel that they're painted in a little bit of a corner because of President Biden's age, because sometimes because of Kamala Harris, Vice President Harris's perceived unpopularity. Whether it's true or not is another question. But it's one of those things, so they don't know quite who to back at the moment, because they're getting sometimes conflicting signals from the White House itself. And so then with Governor Newsom saying, you know what, I'm taking myself out of the 2024 equation, that sort of rocks the boat a little bit more for the Democrats. And so it's going to be interesting to see what the next 6 months brings for them.
It certainly will be. But you say Democrats are in a bind, but Republicans are not in a much better position, are they? I mean, you wrote recently that, quote, as long as Trump is considered a viable candidate for 2024 or a political force by the left, the fatigue and hate will be enough to drive many Americans to the polls to vote against any Republican. Many Democrats hope that Trump will be the Republican nominee because they believe he would be the easiest candidate to beat. Do they have a point, given all the extra baggage that his candidacy brings?
I mean, Ghida, they have a great point. It's one of those things where, again, if you speak to a number of Republicans, conservatives, people of faith, most of them still like Trump's policies from 2016, 2020. But the problem is now he is perceived by many Republican conservative voters as the schoolyard bully, right? And it's one of those things where right after he announced this, 2 weeks ago, I've spoken with 20 Republicans who voted for Trump in 2016 and 2020, and Ghida, not one of the 20 is willing to vote for him now. None of them want him to run. And so then if he doesn't run, I mean, he says he's going to run, but I'm still not entirely convinced he's going to go through with the entire campaign, because again, I think part of it is keeping his franchise viable for as long as humanly possible.
Bernie Sanders just recently said that a Trump candidate would be an absolute horror show for the health of American democracy, but probably a good thing for those who want Republicans to lose in 2024. And you have nearly 6 in 10 Americans who view Trump's 2024 run as a bad thing. You said he's too divisive, but is he also a spent force? As many Democrats believe, they say he is infinitely weaker today than he was in 2016.
Well, I think this, again, there is some sound reasoning behind that argument, Ghida, for sure. And it's one of those things where for Donald Trump, if I were advising him, which I'm not, I would say, look, you probably have 30 million votes still in your back pocket. And much better to be a kingmaker behind the scenes and try to support a pragmatic, common sense Republican ticket than to get out there just because of your ego, because you can't stand the fact that somebody else is getting more press than you, and really throw a monkey wrench into the Republican chances for 2024. At this moment, he doesn't seem to be doing that or taking that advice. But we'll see if he goes through with the campaign over the next 6 months.
And of course, it's a big question if he can overcome his legal problems, if he is indicted before the election. But can the Republican Party afford to move against him and move away from him by backing someone else?
I do think, Ghida, that now more and more Republicans, they were definitely more afraid of taking him on in 2016, 2020, even 2021. But I think now they're becoming more and more emboldened to say, like, guess what? In some ways, it's an empty vessel. We can take that on. We can defeat him. We like his policies. We can replicate some of his policies, but we need to push him off the national stage. And I do believe more and more Republicans of stature are starting to, pick up on that theme.
And if we see a rerun of 2016, Biden versus Trump, who do you think wins?
If we do, and I don't believe that will happen, only because I'm not convinced that President Biden is going to run in 2024. But if we did, I think it would still, the tables would still tilt towards President Biden and Vice President Harris.
But what do you say to those who believe that Biden can win again because they say he won the first time? And although it is the Electoral College vote that matters, he did win by more than 7 million votes.
Well, he did, but the other side of that argument that, some of the Trump supporters would give you is that, it basically came down to 3 states, and if Trump had flipped 60,000 votes, he would have been president as well because of the Electoral College. But I think also when you look at really, really, highly acclaimed Democratic strategists like David Axelrod, for instance, who just talked about this recently on CNN, that he does not believe, no matter what the Biden White House says, that Biden is going to be a viable candidate for 2024, only because of, maybe, again, his age, some perceived cognitive issues and other things. And so, again, it's at what point, do you say, I've done a great job, I've been president, I'm 80 years of age now, I want to turn it over to, the next team member. And I think, that conversation is going to go on, basically weekly in the White House for the next few months.
Would Kamala Harris be a viable option?
She is a viable option. Again, she's got a lot of negative press. There are a number of Democrats that, in fact, probably don't want her to run. But it's one of those things, too, where, again, as we talked about, you can never say never in politics. It's one of those things where, Bill Clinton became president because in 1992, so many Democrats were fearful of running against my old boss, President George H.W. Bush, because his popularity was so high. And look what happened. Then Governor Clinton jumped into the race and became a 2-term president. So I think nowadays, especially, anything's on the table. And if I were Kamala Harris and if I were advising her, I would say, just, step up to the table and take a chance.
All right. Former White House official Douglas Mackinnon, good to have you on the program. Thanks very much.
It's my pleasure. It was an honor.
In modern history, gerontocracy used to be the preserve of many communist states, chiefly the Soviet Union and China, governed by elderly leaders. Age was a rite of passage to leadership positions. Not so today. France, the UK, Spain, Italy, and Canada now have heads of state or government in their 40s and early 50s. Surprisingly, it is the US which has become, to some extent, a gerontocracy, with Joe Biden holding the record of the oldest president the US has ever inaugurated. And it's not only the president. The age of the 100 US senators averaged 64 in 2021. And yet, as of now, the presumptive frontrunner of the Democratic Party in the 2024 presidential election remains Joe Biden, who, if elected, would beat his own record as the oldest US president to take the oath of office. He would be 82. His potential challenger, Donald Trump, would be 78 at the time of the elections. Presumably, Republicans will have vigorous primaries to select their nominee, so the chances of candidate Trump are still uncertain. For the Democrats, however, Biden is most likely to be on the ticket if he decides to run. So in short, Democrats have a choice to make. Can they afford to field again a candidate who, age aside, is not necessarily a magnet for a new generation of young Democrats, liberals, and progressives, according to polls? Can Biden prevail again and appeal to critical young voters? There's little doubt that to run a country, experience matters. But age matters too. According to the Greek philosopher Plato, it is, quote, for the elder man to rule and for the younger to submit. This may still hold true today, with a caveat that in Plato's days, life expectancy was such that elders back then were in their 50s. That's all from me, Ghida Fakhry, and the team. Thanks for watching.